Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Fresh Start Today. I am co-host Sean Roby, and we have our wonderful guest co-host today, attorney Tarina Franklin. How you doing?
I am great, Mr. Roby.
Good.
But as we already know, it's attorney Tarina Washington Franklin.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Now, what we'll do, because in the interest of time, we'll kind of get things rolling. But prior to us doing that, just one quick community announcement. This Saturday, June 25th, for all of the foster parents out there, there will be a foster care collaborative training on youth engagement practice in care. And this training is going to be held at the UWM School of Continuing Education down at the Grand Avenue Mall. If you have not registered yet, please do so with your respective agencies. Also, June, and we're approaching the end of it, but June is still National Safety Month, Men's Health Month, Effective Communication, LGBT Pride, and Child Vision Awareness Month. So we definitely want to make sure we are staying on top of our health. We are communicating appropriately, which ties into what we'll be going over today, as well as we want to send our prayers and thoughts out to all of the families who were touched, families and friends who were impacted by the incident in Florida. So without further ado, today we will be talking with attorney Washington Franklin about understanding the relationship between the grandparents of some of the families that are in out-of-home care, as well as biological families who children have not got into foster care, but then, and just looking at the child welfare system in general. Now, grandparents have always played a major role in the fabric of families in many cultures throughout history, whether it's passing down traditions, teaching right from wrong, or just being an elder to the rest of the family. These relatives and others are still playing a major role in the family unit today. But given the dynamics of families, particularly when they get involved with the system, these families need assistance. Today we'll talk about some of those things. Attorney Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Roby.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is very befitting, especially in light of the fact that we've just celebrated Mother's Day and just recently celebrated Father's Day, and how that all ties into the topic before the audience this afternoon about the significant importance and role of grandparents, and just how that really affects the family overall, how that has a direct impact on these children that have unfortunately become a part of the system, as you've described, the child welfare system, and then just kind of extending to the audience an opportunity to have knowledge and insight as to the pros and cons of how the system is designed when these children are in fact taken or removed, we won't say taken, or removed from what is being alleged as a child in need of protective services. The first thing that we should identify, that statute that governs the authority by law is here in Wisconsin is under Chapter 4813, when it's considered to be jurisdiction of children in need of protection of services.
Which is called CHIPS.
That's exactly right. That's the acronym, CHIPS, Child in Need of Protective Services. And I basically have had the experience for probably the last 3 to 4 direct past years to deal directly with our children court system here. That's, well, now the Vel Phillips Justice Center. I'm so used to saying the Children Court Center, but nevertheless, the Vel Phillips Justice Center on Watertown Plankinton Road, and just how the intricacies of the dynamics between when the child is first removed from the natural parent's care until we actually end up in the court system, and the grandparents' involvement in assisting with the court system and trying to hopefully return these children to their parents.
And that's critical in itself, because a lot of times we hear questions from applicants and foster parents to say, hey, when kids first come into the care, why aren't they looking at family members and whatnot? But the system does look at families. However, you have to look at the circumstances. If it's 11:30 at night, 2 in the morning, and this child is being removed from whatever parent's home, they're going to pose to that parent there, hey, are there any other relatives available who can take this child. But then even with that, there has to be a vetting process where background checks and all that are done. So some kids may come into the system temporarily, 2 days, 2 weeks, until they're able to identify somebody both on the maternal and paternal side.
And that's absolutely correct, Sean. What I've seen when that happens is, like you said, time is of the essence. There's an urgent issue before, the social workers, the crisis worker that has to go in swiftly and remove these children from what is perceived as an immediate issue for the children's best interest as far as safety concerns. So there may not be enough time at that very given moment to adequately investigate the suitability of these grandparents. But once all of that's determined and we have the initial hearing and the probable cause hearing, and I guess just to back up so the audience can understand, when a child is removed, the first thing that happens is what's the probable cause hearing. Essentially, is for the court to determine whether or not we have legal justification in removing these children as the petition or the complaint has set forth the reasons why these children have been removed. More likely than not, most of those hearings are going to be found to have probable cause because it's just too recent for the court to determine and risk returning a child when there hasn't been enough thorough investigation. At those hearings, then that's when the courts start looking to the social worker to do a thorough investigation to see whether or not suitability can be achieved in placing the children with the grandparents. A lot of times grandparents want their grandkids because, as we all know, they're their grandchildren.
Right. Those are my
so
babies.
that established family relationship has been given, and they can't understand why the children are not immediately placed in their care. A lot of people, which I've seen, unfortunately, they have to understand that if they themselves, no matter how long in time duration it has been, if they themselves have ever had a case where they were perceived to be the maltreater, that immediately knocks them out. In a lot of cases, maybe 20, 30 years ago, but the Bureau still takes that into great consideration in their risk analysis in placing these children.
Now, when you say that, does that mean whether it's a unsubstantiated case or a substantiated case?
That's a great question. I've seen it on both levels.
Wow.
I actually have seen it on both levels. I mean, argumentatively, if it's substantiated, that kind of implies a greater concern that, these grandchildren may not necessarily be placed there.
Right.
But if it's unsubstantiated, I think the caseworker is a little bit more lenient to give a little bit more special consideration in his or her investigation.
And that makes more sense because we many times we have providers or applicants who may have had substantiations in their history, whether it was from somebody just calling in next door, from a school, upset, whatever the case, or mandated reporters having to call in.
Right.
So a lot of people, and many people may not even know that process when somebody calls in on you. There's a call, the calls are made to 220-SAFE, and it's call access. And what happens is anybody, a mandated reporter or somebody who's disgruntled or whatever the case, can call in on a person and say, ABC is doing this here. And so depending on whether or not they have to screen it in or not, if it's screened out, most cases you never know about it.
That is absolutely
correct. And
there's
so many people out here who have screen outs on them, and it may be 10, 15 screen outs that they never knew about. But when it's screened in, that's where the assessment component that you talk about has to come into play.
That's exactly correct. So I think for purposes of moving forward with our topic of the day, we're going to assume that the investigation of the grandparents has taken place, they've checked out, and now these children are now being placed in the temporary care of the grandparents. I guess where we should really kind of just hammer in really is to discuss the dynamics within the family as it relates to now this grandchild has been removed from a natural parent's care and has been temporarily placed in the care of the biological grandparent, and the dynamics that in of itself can cause both beneficially and sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes very detrimental to the outcome of the case.
Right.
I've been involved in cases where you would assume that the grandparents' desire to step in and to assist is done with the intent and love and helping the grandchild be placed back in the natural parent's care. But as we shared before we took the radio station, I've also seen cases where the grandparent has made it extremely difficult to return the grandchild to the parent's care. And these are parents who are reasonably demonstrating great efforts of success of return to have these kids placed back in their care. So you definitely have that conflict going on. And I think most attorneys that are aiding the families, be it an intake attorney and be it an attorney that may actually be hired privately by the grandparents, because I've seen that too. They feel so strong and compelled that their kids should not have these children returned to their care. I've actually been contacted, I know for a fact, our office on several occasions to represent the grandparents, to be basically an intervening party, because we're saying, no, these parents are not doing what we believe is in our grandchildren's best interest.
Wow.
And we don't want these kids returned to their care. So just imagine, you're sitting in court, you're representing a grandparent who maybe by the just calculation of things is maybe 50, who's gotten their life together, a little bit more stable than, their 23-year-old daughter or 23-year-old son who's never really been faced with this.
Right.
And you would want to believe that the intent is genuine, but it may not necessarily be. I mean, I think I've shared with you that sometimes they feel like maybe it's a second kick at the cat. Maybe they didn't do such a effective parenting when they had their kids, and this is an opportunity to, start again.
Right. And with that there, from an attorney's perspective, because attorneys in many cases that I've experienced, they get a lot of their information from case managers and any other secondary reports that they can get.
Sure.
How does an attorney assess that and looking at the greater good and the best interest of that child?
Well, you got to make sure you understand the distinction in the roles you're playing. If you're the guardian ad litem, and that really is the attorney that's appointed to represent the concept of the best interest of the child, they have accessibility to all of these records without any problems. If you're the intake attorney from Children's Court Center that has been appointed to represent the actual parents, you have just as much accessibility to have direct communications with the caseworkers and receive and request different records necessary to achieve goal compliance. Goal compliance is, basically what the dispositional orders are asking for you to have your children returned to you. Where you're going to find some problems, though, is, again, grandparents really are not being looked to as having what the courts like to say standing in a case. And standing essentially means that, yes, we appreciate the fact that you have stepped up. Relative. Right. Exactly. Not mama, not daddy, but relative. We appreciate that you have stepped up to the plate to help take care of these kids, what is initially going to be perceived with the intent of reunification of these children to their natural parents. But again, getting back to the attorney's role, when you're hired privately to represent the grandparents, you may not have as much accessibility or as much cooperation with the caseworkers because, again, you are not really legally connected to the case where that is considered to be an obligation given to you by the court that you can act upon. I mean, it's more or less a courtesy respect. So that just goes to you establishing these different professional relationships with the caseworkers and the case managers. But if it really seems like, it's going to be highly contested and things like that, unless the court has actually given an order instructing where you now are considered a party of interest to the case, grandparents, for the most part, when they come to these hearings, the only thing they can do is sit their butts in the chairs right on the back of the wall or in the hall.
Wow. Unless special circumstances and they're asked to speak on behalf of.
That is absolutely correct.
Wow.
And so you already know what the dynamics are there because now the court, through this process, has basically placed these grandchildren in the care of their grandparents, but they're, in one sense, we're being entrusted to the grandparents to take the physical custody of these kids, help them make sure they get to school, make sure they get to the doctors, make sure they do their homework.
All the parenting roles.
But then you get to court and you can't say squat diddly.
Wow. Now, before we take a break, one thing that you mentioned, you said the GAL, which is the guardian ad litem.
That is correct.
And that is the attorney for who?
The child or the children.
Children under what age?
Okay, in children's court is different. It's
Okay.
under 12.
Okay.
But again, you got to make sure you understand it's not that they are the attorney for the actual child. They are the attorney appointed to represent the concept of the best interest. And a
Okay.
lot of times people get that role misunderstood.
Okay.
Because it's a concept. So you can legally, if you really feel like the child's best interest is contrary to what the guardian ad litem is stating to the court, I've seen cases where they can petition the court for their own advocate counsel. That's
Okay.
an adversarial attorney who now represents the child. So you
Wow.
can see how all of these different dynamics can continue to expand.
Wow.
Just based on the removal of these children.
Now, when children are over 12, particularly when we're talking about children's court, they get just, and I don't want to say just, but they get a public defender.
That is correct.
Okay.
Right. But that's more associated with like delinquency petitions.
Okay.
But yeah, I've seen it in CHIPS, but usually the attorney in the child in need of protection of services is the guardian ad litem for the children.
Okay.
For the best interest concept, rather.
Okay. Because we've had cases in different referrals and heard of different circumstances where you have children who are over 12.
Right.
And they have a lot of conversations with their attorney or
Right.
GAL, depending on the dynamics of the case. And those attorneys present to them like, hey, you're scheduled for visitation and whatnot. And so they have more power in their position. And those kids say, hey, I don't want to go with the visits with my mother, or I don't want to go on visits with my grandparents or my father.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I mean, I just think the way that our legal statute is designed, both in children's court as well as family court, as you would imagine, the age of a child is going to have a significant importance as to, the outcome of certain rules and regulations. I mean, right, of 13-year-olds, representation is going to probably be identified a little bit more stronger than a 3-year-old having a temper tantrum saying, no, I don't want to go see mama because she's not going to give me no popcorn tonight.
Right. Okay. Well, what we're going to do, wonderful folks out there, we are going to take a brief break. We will be back momentarily, and we'll pick this up on Fresh Start Today.
Do you know what Nelson Mandela, Andrew Jackson, Malcolm X, and Steve Jobs have in common? Each of these individuals were world leaders who were once in foster care. We often hear about the road from foster care to prison, but did you know there's another road from foster care to a world stage? Fresh Start Family Services is looking for adults to become licensed foster parents. Every child needs a caring adult in their lives. Wouldn't it be great if you could foster or adopt the next world leader? For more information on how you can become licensed with Fresh Start, please call 414-351-1100. That is 351-1100. This is Jermaine reporting from Fresh Start's WBCM, Wisconsin Black Children Matter. Did you know that the number of black children in Milwaukee's foster care community continues to rise? According to the Department of Children and Families' most recent annual report, black children made up 68.2% of Milwaukee's foster kids. Many of these children are not only removed from their family and siblings, but are placed in families and communities that do not reflect or honor their race, culture, or heritage. Fresh Start is an agency that is committed to serving and advocating for black children. In order to meet the needs of this growing population, we need more black families in the Milwaukee area that love and celebrate black children. To become a licensed, culturally responsive foster parent with Fresh Start, you must be 21 years old, married or single with a stable income, clear several criminal background checks, and complete 36 hours of pre-licensing training. To learn more about other qualifications, call 414-351-1100. That's 414-351-1100. Again, this is Jermaine reporting from Fresh Start, WBCM, Wisconsin Black Children Matter.
Good afternoon. Definitely a lovely day here at Fresh Start today. We are going to jump back into the conversation. And again, it's in the courtroom with attorney Washington Franklin. And we're talking about grandparents and the whole dynamics of the child welfare system and whatnot. Now, before we went to break, we were talking about GALs and their responsibilities in relation to working with kids in out-of-home care, or just when there's custody and whatnot, when those type of legal situations. Now, I was talking to some gentlemen this morning, and they were saying that part of the issue when you look at family dynamics today is that families can't discipline their kids anymore.
True.
And one of the things is, if you look at your kids too hard or whatnot, your kids are taken out of your care. And granted, that was a very extreme example, but looking at your experience and talking about grandparents and how they always come into play in a lot of these situations, whether for the good or not, how does that happen?
Well, first of all, our audience needs to understand that, yes, we can't abuse our kids. That's how they end up in the system. But there is a huge distinction between discipline and abuse. Abuse is obviously broken skin, broken body parts, broken limbs, bruises.
Right.
So you can discipline your child.
Right.
You just can't apply excessive abuse.
Right.
So we definitely want to put that caveat out there. But nevertheless, following up from how that relates with grandparents, because historically, and especially historically in our African American community,
Right.
who did the whoopings or spankings, as other people may refer to?
Different cultures, right?
It was Grandma. Medea, she was like, you better go find that switch for me.
Go get it.
Switch,
Yeah.
if y'all remember back in the day.
Right.
So, I mean, we still have to deal with that because some of the times the children who have now been placed in the temporary care of the grandparents, some situations do present. We're dealing with an older generation
Right.
of grandparents whose brains are still registering to use that switch and to use that as a form of discipline. So you're not too far fetched from that concern. It is a valid concern, but I think the situation now is the greatness of these caseworkers. They do, for the most part, stay on top of it and ensuring that the kids, while placed in the grandparents' care,
Right.
are thriving. I mean,
Because-
that's what we're operating off, thriving, and with
yeah.
the intent of returning these children to their parents.
Because that's so difficult, because when you speak about somebody who may be 50 or 60, and so they have 40 years of parenting.
Correct.
Their children are full-fledged adults. And so now you want me to put my grandchild on timeout versus doing what I've been doing and look at these other kids.
Right.
And so that's definitely a paradigm shift for parents, or particularly grandparents.
Exactly.
And so one thing, when we always talk about the referrals that we receive, because we get referrals and it'll clearly say in there, this child is going to a relative, but then we may get that same referral 2-3 weeks later,
Right.
saying, you know what, this child was placed with a relative or like kin,
Correct.
and the behaviors are too out of control where they can't manage. So we need to give a bed for this child tonight.
Right.
And so when we talk to our providers, we have to let them know that we have to always keep in mind when working with the children that come into their homes, everybody has a different normal. And that's so critical, because my normal may be a 2-parent home, very quiet, food every night. We sat at the table and ate together and then played video games and whatnot. Another person's normal may be it's chaotic. The parent is never home.
Sure.
Never met my mother before. My daddy said she was ABCD. So you got all these different dynamics. So we always want to promote and tell our providers that we have to always take a step back from what our experience is.
Very
and
true.
try to place ourselves in these kids' shoes.
That's true. And that's what the Bureau wants and desires, and hopefully under that clock that's ticking to return these kids within that 15-month time frame to the
Right.
parents' care. We're hopeful that collectively everyone is on board to support that goal of reunification.
And when you mention the Bureau, just for our listeners, when Attorney Washington Franklin talks about the Bureau, it is now the DMCPS, or the Division of Milwaukee Child Protective Services. So
Thank you.
just for clarity purposes for people out there. Also, this is a open discussion. I failed to mention that earlier. So if you do have any questions, comments, or experiences related to child welfare, definitely you can give us a call at 414-444-5250. Because, and the reason I pose that to the audience, because we get calls literally all the time about relatives dealing with issues with case managers. The children were taken, but the grandparents were never even considered as an option and whatnot. So this
I
platform
think
is important.
This platform is very important, and I appreciate the opportunity to be involved with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think with those unique situations, it's most imperative that the parents who as I informed the audience earlier, who still very much have a speaking voice to the judge, if everyone is in tune and really truthfully working towards the best interests of these children being the ultimate goal of reunification to the natural parents, the best voice to be heard in court is the actual parents who can communicate to the judge,
Right.
who can communicate to their intake attorney, hi, Grandma Lee or Grandpa Joe, I want them placed there.
Right.
Why are my kids not being placed there? Why are my kids being placed in Oconomowoc? Why are my kids being placed in Cedarburg? I don't know that community. My parents don't know that community. These are legitimate questions that need to be voiced intelligently, not argumentatively,
Right.
but intelligently through the natural parents, because they have a voice. The courts allow them to have a voice, a respectful voice, but a voice.
Okay. Now, when you talk about that voice being respectful, if the children were removed from one particular parent,
Right?
and let's just say dad,
Sure.
but then mom, she wasn't aware of it, but now she's involved, does mom have that same access or say in that hearing,
Oh,
in
yeah.
that process?
The parents are equally part of the process of reunification. So even if the children were removed from the father and or the mother, and the other parent didn't have any knowledge of why, and provided service was achieved on the other parent, gosh, yes, the first and foremost concern is safety being assessed. If the alleged incident occurred under the watch of one parent, there is a great situation for that other parent to gain the custody and placement of the child while the case is being sorted out. When we kind of preface this conversation today about grandparents having to intervene, it was under the impression that it hadn't been determined where the safety and risk concerns really
Right.
fall into place, and that was with the impression that they had not properly looked to the father and or the mother. So
Right.
we were looking at it from that perspective.
Right.
But no, the courts would reasonably allow placement to occur with the other parent.
Okay. In your experience, because you mentioned earlier the different dynamics of the case and the relationships between whether it's the grandparents and their children, and then now you have the grandchild who is placed with the grandparent, and so now you got all these different dynamics.
Right.
When you talk about conflict resolution, do the courts ever request or supply mediators?
Right. And again, depending on what the real issue is, there is an opportunity at the Children's Court Center or the Vail Phillips Justice Center. There they have a jury room. They encourage the parties to get there to have mediation. That's, done usually formally. It's by an agreement of the parties that we are going to come here and just really put aside all of our difference with the intent to really try to just resolve these issues. But also, at most of these different agency sites, they have conference rooms. And again, you can always request an opportunity to have a mediation. It's not really identified as mediation.
Okay.
It's more referenced as a settlement conference. And the courts appreciate that, because what court really wants to get involved to the point when on the eve of that 15th month and they say, oh my God, you pretty much know they haven't done what needs to be done. And now we're going to be moving for the unfortunate thing of termination of parental rights. I mean, talk about conflict resolution that needs to be achieved quickly.
Right.
Is at that time, because now we are moving into another arena where this child, and if we're still relying on the fact that the child has continuously been placed in the care of the grandparent, and for whatever reasons, the natural parent has not been able to successfully complete the
Court conditions?
court conditions,
Yeah.
and now we're moving towards TPR. What is that going to look like? Day one, you're the mama. Day two, you still are the daughter of grandma, but now your child has just become your sibling.
Exactly.
So, yeah, court at its finest. So they don't want to get to that point. Can you imagine? I mean, and that's very much a realistic outcome, because most of the times when we move to TPR status, a termination of parental rights, the courts are going to look to where has this child been primarily situated
Right.
or resided during the pendency of this case. And usually they prefer to maintain that stability.
Right.
So you can imagine the conflict that that's going to create.
And that's scary in itself because when you talk about co-parenting, whether it's a single grandparent and their daughter or their son, there still has to be some level of co-parenting there if the rights haven't been terminated and whatnot.
Right.
And the reality is, if a person didn't meet their court conditions, there's a strong possibility, especially if they're with that grandparent, that they still may see their child indirectly on some level or another, whether it's 4th of July or any other holiday. So, but with that, do you have any tips, or what tips could you offer people when knowing that there is definitely a chance that there's going to be some type of friction there, whether it's between grandmother and her son or grandmother and the case manager?
Right. I would just suggest to the listeners that at the end of the day, these are our children. At the end of the day, these are your children. At the end of the day, you want your child returned to you. And as Malcolm X used to say, by any means necessary.
Right.
So that basically means forget that your grandma or your mama didn't feed the baby the cheeseburger that you would have given the baby. Forget all of that. Put aside your crazy differences. Forget that. Forget that the grandma or grandpa took the child to the therapist appointment and you didn't know. Okay, we need to collectively work together as a family with the understanding that we are all on the same team as it relates to granddaughter or grandson to get our babies back home.
Right.
Because this is real truth. This is not pretend. This is not pretend court. This is real court, real federal rules and regulations, real process and procedures that are moving forward, that if you do not act accordingly, you run the risk of having your child completely taken out of your care and custody.
And I appreciate how you frame that. How do you have that real conversation with folks? Is that like the initial meeting out at Children's Court, or
are you asking me as the attorney, or
in general, if that was a case that you were on?
Well, most of my clients know I'm that real attorney anyway, so I keep it real. So yeah, I tell them straight up, okay, look, grandma got your baby. This is what's gonna happen. This is what I need you to be on board with me, so you can get your baby back. That's how I handle my clients. If any of my clients out there that know me, they will validate that. And I would expect that my colleagues would have maybe not as real of a conversation, but they will make sure that the person that they're representing understand, look, you need to coexist with your mom. You need to coexist with your dad. You need to work collectively to have these children or this child return to your care.
Now, I got to take a step back because you said you're that real attorney.
Oh, yes, most definitely.
Now, is that code language for your direct? And I'm asking that because you may get another attorney who says, you know what, I'm real too.
Oh, yeah.
I'll go out there 110.
Yeah. And I have a lot of colleagues that are real attorney, but I think for me specifically, in doing this for 18 years, it was a combination of both family court, which, primarily is downtown court, and then recently becoming involved in the children court system in the last 4 to 5 years. I guess I get to a point where you stop sugarcoating stuff and you keep it real. So when I say I'm that real attorney, my clients know I just keep it real. I just tell it like it is. I'm not trying to sugarcoat because I feel like my job is to give you the best legal representation.
Right.
And that's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
And if I have to keep it real, and sometimes profanity has come out of my mouth, and keeping it real, and that's what you understand in the language, and like, okay, you need to shut it up. This is how it's going to go down.
Okay.
Yeah, if you call it being direct, I'm direct. But at the end of the day, I'm sure I'm getting a big hug when your baby is coming back home to you.
Oh, thank you, Attorney Washington Franklin.
Exactly. Getting invited over for the family party. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Now, for folks out there who would love to learn more about you and your expertise, how could they contact you?
Thank you. My office is located at 2828 North 60th Street, and that's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53210. Our phone number is 414-444-4260.
Okay. You mentioned the family has to work as a team.
That's right.
Team is a wonderful concept. Team, to me, stands for every team. Together, everyone achieves more.
There you go.
Oh, LeBron James and the Cavaliers, Golden State. Moving right along. When we talk about team, one thing we definitely want to keep in mind, just a couple quick things. Agree on a common goal, because that's so important, because this is our, and I appreciate how you framed it. This is our grandson. This is your son. This is our baby.
Right.
And we want him with the family.
Correct.
Communicate about the process, because when we know better, we do better.
That's correct.
And that's always critical. Agree to disagree on some points. And the reality is you will never agree with somebody 100% of the time.
And let me just intervene right there, Sean, if I can. Agree to disagree. But people, please do not have those disagreements in front of the freaking caseworker. Do not have those disagreements 5 minutes before the case is called. I mean, sometimes we just got to take it back old school. We need to have them conversations that are conversations for the house.
Right.
Conversations for us.
Right.
Conversations for the family.
Okay.
Outside the presence of the child, of course. But if you come to children's court acting a fool, acting a donkey, you're being watched. You're being observed. So you may start off having a child placed in your care just because you're the grandma or the grandpa. But the caseworker, if they see constant friction and like a rubber band just expanding back and forth,
Right.
the rubber band breaks.
Right.
And the case manager, is entrusted to make sure that that rubber band does not break at the peril of this children's well-being.
Right.
So don't have the freaking disagreements in front of these people. I just understand that. I mean, some dirty laundry need to stay in your house and keep it washed there. Let's just keep it real.
Wash it.
I just don't understand why we, as people, feel like to put on a show. You can show at home, right at 53210, 53206,
Okay.
53208.
Right.
And not to say 53224 don't exist either, but necessarily, if you want to show out at home. Please.
Right.
Please do that outside of the presence of the kid. I just don't get it. Thank you for saying that, because, yeah.
And it's funny because you said not in the presence of the child. And a lot of people, when there is friction and there is conflict, because a lot of us may not have the abilities to resolve conflict healthy.
Correct.
So somebody may just totally downtrodden and disrespect that other parent,
Yep.
or the grandparent,
Correct.
or vice versa. And so those are some of those things that we have to keep in mind that we don't want to do. The same thing applies to foster parents when they have a child in their care, and the foster parent may have read the referral and see all these egregious things that the biological parent did.
Right.
But that's not something to talk to that 5-year-old or the 15-year-old about.
That's
because
exactly
kids hold their families in a certain regard, and we still want to honor and respect that.
Right.
And that's not saying that we should lie to kids, but we still want to allow them to have some type of respect towards their parents.
That's exactly correct.
The next thing I had on here is build trust in an atmosphere of honesty when we're talking about that team concept. And I think that goes back to when you were talking about you're real, along with that directness, or however a person want to frame it. But then also acknowledge our own issues and motivations.
Right.
Because I think with that, everybody comes to the team with a different goal.
Right.
Cleveland had a goal, moving right along, but when you got different dynamics, because you may have a social worker who needs her court report done, you may have a crisis worker who needs to meet with their client so they can get their notes in. Then you may have a TFC worker, which is a treatment foster care worker, and then you got the medical staff. So you got all these different people. So people have different similar goals, but then they're still different at the same time. So we want to be mindful of that and respect everybody's position, but then still allow everybody to get their goals met.
That's true.
So
Conversation is great.
Oh, yeah. Conflict resolution. And just to go back to the parents.
Right.
The parents and not saying things around the child.
Oh, because the child will report. Innocently done, a child will go back and tell that care provider or that social worker or that case manager. And then that comes back to bite the parent in the butt.
Right.
You told the kid, and in those reports, it's always reflected. You told the kid that grandma didn't tell me about the parent-teacher conference. You told the kid that I didn't make it to your therapy session because I had to work third shift. Or
I didn't feel like going.
I didn't feel like going.
Right.
So, yeah, some things you just don't need to discuss with your kids because they will go back and tell every single thing. And they have no reason to believe it's not healthy. They just are having, in their mind, a very innocent conversation.
But I do also, because I feel I have to say this, you do have other children who have become equipped with certain survival skills.
Sure.
And so they know how they can split and part people as well. So you do have kids, and we get referrals like that all the time as well, that say this child has a history of making allegations.
Right.
And so we always like to tell providers that on the front end, so they don't run into something and now they're upset and now they don't want a child placed in their home no more, because going under the investigation, whether it's biological family or foster family, that can be very strenuous for not only that foster parent or that biological parent, but everybody else living in that household.
Oh, gosh, yes. It can be very strenuous and very stressful and very time-consuming.
Oh, yeah.
Even though, and our audience probably needs to have this understanding, too, before we leave for the day, is even though the court system may not make a legal finding of maltreatment or neglect or abuse, it is still within the, and I'm going to have to refer to you again, I'm going to keep saying bureau, because
DMCPS. I mean, they change it every.
The DMCPS.
Some of the agencies change all the time, but Division of Milwaukee Child Protective Services.
There you go. It is still within their discretion to keep the case alive and make an actual referral administratively to see if you have still or should be identified as a maltreater. Those are two separate, very, very different actions.
Explain that a little more.
You can meet the threshold that under these Chapter 48 elements, you don't rise to a child in need of protection of services under the CHIPS. And that component has now been dismissed. But it is still within the agency's discretion, or the Bureau, DCF.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go that way.
Our people.
Right.
To make a referral that you may be looked to as a maltreater. And because of that, those proceedings are done within an administrative capacity downtown, but you still may be on the hook for that unfortunate identification too.
Wow.
And that goes directly back to the whole foster care situation. If you are identified a maltreater, even at an administrative level, I would believe that would be a preclusion for you to secure your foster care licensing, because it's a direct correlation as to your ability to be deemed a suitable caretaker of these children.
Right. And even with the radio advertisement that came up, and on there is Jermaine, and he kind of breaks down some of those qualifications, but then there are other things in a battery of background checks and whatnot that have to be conducted. So it's definitely, it's a variety of things that all come into play when a person does have to go through that process and ultimately get all the way through it before a child is even considered to be placed in their home. One other really quick thing, because we've talked about grandparents and birth parents, foster parents. One thing I want to bring up is the whole concept of shared parenting.
Sure.
And with that, it could be in the biological family, whether it's the grandparents as well as the parents, or an aunt or an uncle, as well as the foster parents. But that's the concept is the foster family or whoever has that child in their care is still working to the best of their ability with the biological parents.
Right.
And it's one of those things that we've seen when it works, or when it's attempted and people really work with it, it does really well. One, for that child, but then the family as well. Because a lot of times when kids are in out-of-home care and the goal is for them to be reunified, and now they're getting extended visits at home, and they're there 4 or 5 days out of the week and only come to the foster home for a couple days. You do have those cases where those biological families look at the foster family as a model.
True. I would agree.
They bounce things off of them, and we've seen cases where it works so well that the child has been returned home now 6 months, 12 months, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and they still have this relationship. Oh. They have holidays together. Yes. That child is being dropped off at the foster parent's home because this parent needs to go to the store, and when he was in your foster home and before he left my home, he still couldn't act right in the store. So they're still, co-parenting.
Right. And I think in those very unique situations, that's just really when it has worked at its best level. And those are very great outcomes. But I've actually seen other levels when the foster parent just couldn't let go and just couldn't believe that they're no longer involved in this child's life and act a stone donkey to do everything to corrupt or compromise that reunification.
Right.
So that's, it's a balancing act. It's definitely a balancing act. It's like the step parent who's no longer the step parent in the sense of now of a divorce.
Right.
So where do we go from here? What do we do? We've created this family-like relationship with this child, and now we have a divorce saying legally I'm no longer connected to you, but I still have emotional attachment to you. So how do we balance that? So what you've described, I would like to honestly say I've seen more than not those positive outcomes, but unfortunately it's usually the other way around.
Right. And that's unfortunate because it should be reversed.
It should
where
be.
More families are able to work with each other, biological and foster families, but some of those instances, you may have a biological family who is still undergoing, other mental health conditions, substance abuse and whatnot. So depending on all those dynamics as well.
Right.
But then the other part, when we talk about that shared parenting or co-parenting aspect, just a couple quick bullets that we also want to keep in mind. One, we want to make sure we define clear boundaries early in that process.
Correct.
So everybody knows their role, what to expect.
Right.
Don't use children as pawns or messengers because, again, that kind of goes back to what you were talking about before. We don't want to downtrot or disrespect one parent while that child is there. But then also respect each other's role in the child's life. One person may be phenomenal at cooking. The other one may be great at just listening to that child. So we want to be mindful of all those things. The other thing, when we talk about parents and that whole concept, please do not ever talk negatively about that other parent in front of that parent.
So true.
Because, again, some of those things hold dear and close to those kids' hearts forever. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is kids learn by seeing and, of course, by books and whatnot. But kids, if their parent is not doing everything that they say they were or should be doing, they will ultimately learn that on their own.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
Now, I think before we go, if you could, again, give your information and how folks could learn more about your expertise.
Oh, thank you. I'm an expert today. Yes, thank you. Again, my name is Tarina Washington Franklin. I'm an attorney. I've been doing this for almost 19 years now. And my office is located at 2828 North 60th Street, right in the city, right there, intersection of 60th and Appleton. You'll see a big white sign, Law Offices of Hazel Washington, right there with her. Milwaukee, 53210 414-444-4260.
Great. And if anyone who's out there who is interested in becoming a foster parent, culturally competent, appropriate, nurturing provider who's open to learning and working with some of our most wonderful children, please give us a call at 414-351-1100. One last thing.
Sure.
Attachment. You mentioned attachment and how sometimes foster parents may compromise because of their bond that they've connected with this child. We always like to tell our foster parents that it's so imperative that you have a life outside of child welfare. Because if you eat, sleep, and drink it, this is all you know. And before you know it, when that child who's been in your home for 3 months or 12 months and then now they return, now you're starting to pick up some potentially unhealthy coping habits and whatnot. So we always like to tell people to please have a life outside of foster care, utilize respite and whatnot so you can still be healthy. And if you're still interested, provide care to another child or sibling group.
That's true.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you again, Attorney Washington Franklin.
You're so
Brother
welcome.
Keon, Brother Tony, thank you all for the wonderful support. You all take care out there and tune in next week. Have a good one.